Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our lunch session, conversation. While the participants of the Riga Conference are eating their lunch, we are going to continue the conversation here, mainly for our live stream audience, but we also have an audience from the conference joining us as well. My name is Adam Reichert. I'm the editor-in-chief of New Eastern Europe, a bi-monthly magazine based in Poland, and I have the honor of hosting this discussion, which is titled Social Media and Foreign Affairs, Who Spins Whom? I think it's a very relevant and timely topic. I'm very pleased that the organizers chose this topic, and we're very lucky to have a very good panel of experts who are going to give us some really good insight and their reflections on this topic. I just want to remind everybody out there who is watching on the live stream that I will be monitoring the Twitter feed, and I do encourage, if you have questions, comments, please feel free to use the hashtag RigaConf17. And I will be monitoring the feed and interjecting some of the comments and questions to our panel, just as we have been throughout the whole conference here. So today we are going to talk about the power of social media, which is, I think, a very incredible phenomenon in terms of looking at humanity. It's been maybe just slightly over 10 years since the social media has really picked up and has become a part of most of our lives. In the beginning, we all thought it was going to be a great way to connect and to integrate societies and peoples around the world, share what we had for dinner, what restaurants we went to, or where we went for holiday. And indeed, Facebook alone has nearly 2 billion users today. The question of whether they're real or not is a different question to decide, but we cannot deny the fact that social media is a very important part of most people's lives on this planet. So we're going to look at how this process has evolved, and how not only is social media used to connect people, which is a very positive thing, but it also how it's being used to start to promote ideas, to enhance emotions, and especially to divide people, which is a very negative side and very negative aspect of social media. And I'm very lucky to have an expert panel of three individuals who are joining me today. On my far left is Mr. Christophe Genesti. He is a digital strategist and communications and PR executive who's going to be giving us some very interesting insight and reflections from his work in looking at social media networks, and he does a lot of advising on social media. So we're looking forward to that. Ben Nemo, who is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. He's done a lot of excellent work uncovering and exposing fake accounts, fake news spreaders, especially ones that are nefariously promoting an agenda which may in fact impact other people's interests. So welcome, Ben. Welcome, Christoph, and last but not least, Konstantin von Eggert, who is a Russian journalist and commentator with Dozh TV Rain in Moscow, and has some keen insight on the situation there as well. So, gentlemen, welcome, and I'm going to start with you, Christoph, right away, because I think I would like for you to kind of set up our discussion and looking at how social media has changed the way we interact. Not only is it a way that we receive information, but it's also a way that emotions are spread throughout the globe, something that has never really we have seen in our history in such a large scale. So are we living in what we could call a brave new world, where our lives are spent more and more on social media, and where the information that we are receiving is shaping not only how we perceive the world, but how we act, how we vote, and how we shape our own ideas?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you very much for the organizers to having me today. It's a great conference. I've been to the different panels yesterday and this morning. It was really inspiring conference. And I will start, if you allow me, with something I heard yesterday evening. I was listening to a panel discussion, and one of the panelists mentioned social media and mainstream media, and he wanted to point that traditional media, what he was calling mainstream media, was different from social media. And what I would like to say as a first take on the discussion is that what is really mainstream today is not anymore traditional media, but what is mainstream today is social media. And you have to understand this as a first take of today's world. Social media is not anymore a new media, is not anymore a new kind of exotic space or whatever. Social media has become mainstream. It has become mainstream for everybody, for political leaders, for journalists, for citizens, for consumers, etc. It is mainstream. And this is the first thing that everybody has to have in mind when approaching this world. Do not consider anymore social media as a separate world that has a kind of a satellite world. It's the mainstream world. It's the number one place where people are making decisions and sharing information. The second thing that you need to have in mind when you consider this is that if you assume that, if you accept the idea that this is a media, social media, you have to understand that this media is very particular. This media, on this media, people are not sharing information, people are sharing mainly emotions, right? So when you're sharing online on Facebook, could be Twitter, could be Instagram, could be whatever kind of network, you know, the first interaction that the network is proposing you to have is a like, is something that you claim that you like something, that you like your friend, you like what your network is doing, etc. So this is, again, something very important to have in mind every time that you're approaching social media. It's not a media carrying information, it's a media carrying mainly emotions, right? The third thing that I would like you to think about when setting the scene of this discussion, we've been talking a lot about fake news today, yesterday, and I would say for the last couple of years, we've been talking about fake news like everywhere. You have again, well, this is my take on it, you have again to consider that fake news is no news, right? It's not new. People have been faking like forever, you know? Human beings are telling lies forever, have been telling lies forever. And political leaders have been promoting fake stories like forever, you know? Coming from the antique world, coming from the, you know, at the time of when people start to socialize, when there's a political power on top of people, on top of any community, you're gonna have fake news, right? You're gonna have fake stuff. So what is new is not the fake news. And you know this Chinese proverb, when the wise man points to the moon, the stupid one looks at the finger. We are spending years and times and tribunes and you know, a lot of energy to comment about fake news, but come on, what is new is the power of sharing, is the power of, you know, carrying those emotions, right? Because every political leader, if you go back to history, we were talking about history in the previous session, and someone was telling, well, it's a really pity that we do not teach history anymore, right? If you teach history, you can go back many centuries, and you will see incredible stories of fake news. If you go to visit antique temples, you know, you will see on the temples themselves sculptures of fake news, right? So in fact, what is new really is not the news itself. What is new is the incredible power of dissemination of those news, right? And the fourth element I would like to put on the table to inspire and set the scene is that this social media is incredibly easy to manipulate and is incredibly cheap to manipulate. Yesterday, Twitter leaders were heard by the American administration because of their potential roles of Russians on the election American election campaigns. And the guy, a Twitter executive, told yesterday that Russia Today, which is one very famous media that we all know, has just bought 1,823 tweets for the amount of money of $200,000. You know, so we're talking about nearly 2,000 tweets just paid, you know, a very little amount of money. So what we have to consider if we're talking about social media, the importance of social media and fake news and that kind of stuff, is that we are facing a very brand new media, right, that is mainstream, and which is a mainstream flow of information, of emotions, sorry about that, and that is so easy to manipulate and to control. So this is really the challenge that every government or every leader must face, or every brand in another area. You are in front of this, and this changes everything. Because if you want to fight propaganda or fake news with facts, as an example, you will lose everything. Because you don't understand that on social media, people don't care about facts. Yeah? People care about emotions. And when I will share something from you, because I know you and I trust you, and if you tweet something about something that is really emotional for you, because I know you, because I respect you, because I trust you, I will eventually retweet it, you know, because I feel that you've got an emotion. I don't know if it's accurate, I don't know if it's relevant, but I will share it. This is the problem. The sharing mechanism is the problem. And last but not least, and I'm sure that Ben will elaborate much more about this. All this social media is powered by robots, right? Is that it's not only a mainstream media, a mainstream emotional flow, but this emotional flow is powered by robots, right? And we assume, different organizations assume that more than 50% of the entire internet traffic is not human, is machines. Right? So when you understand that you can manipulate this, you can have an impact on this, you can be helped concretely by machines who will spread the news further than you would have dreamed to spread the news.
Well, thank you very much, Christophe. I think it was some very good points setting up this discussion, and very interesting how you ended, especially about robots who are spreading emotions, right? In some ways, it is a little bit of the artificial intelligence question of robots lacking emotions, but they're at least sharing our own, right? Yeah. And so that brings us perfectly to you, Ben, someone who has been deeply involved in researching and uncovering trolls and bots and other nefarious ways that social media has been using. Maybe you could provide some perspective on what Christophe has already said, and also discuss about the dangers of social media and how it's being used to shape our ideas, especially in the West, where we have open debate and this kind of tradition of being open and transparent, when at the same time it's very easily, as Christophe has mentioned on social media, to manipulate.
Absolutely, and what Christophe was saying reminded me of an interview I did 2 weeks ago, in which the first question from the journalist was, are social media a threat to democracy? And if you just go back 5 years in time, 2011, 2012, the Arab Spring, how many headlines were there about Twitter and Facebook and Instagram as the new drivers of democracy? And there was this idea that the Arab Spring was born from the power of social media. So in 6 years, we've flipped from they're the best thing ever to are they a threat to democracy? That's an astonishingly rapid turnaround. What I mainly do is work on bots and trolls. And it's really important to understand the distinction, and something that I'm seeing a lot at the moment is people do not get the distinction. A couple of years back, the word troll was going around, and anybody who made any comment online which disagreed with somebody would be called a troll. Nowadays, what I'm seeing a lot is that anybody makes any unpleasant comment, particularly in the US setting, will be called a bot. So purely for the sense of clarity, a troll is a human being for a given value of human being, probably a fairly bored and nasty one, who sits at the keyboard and types unpleasant stuff. But a troll has fingers, and it has a heart, and it has a pulse, and it probably has various attitude issues, and maybe gets paid to do it. But a troll writes its own posts and then posts them. A bot is a social media account which is run by autopilot, effectively. So it will retweet other people, it will like other people, it will follow other people. There are very sophisticated bots out there which can actually look like they create their own posts. But the great majority of bots are simply accounts which are run on autopilot. And it's really important to understand not all bots are bad. A bot is simply a program, an account run by autopilot. So, for example, all the big news organizations use bots, because rather than employing somebody to say, oh, we've just done a headline, I'm going to type it in and post it, you get a bot to do it. There are bots which post poetry. There's a bot which used to take every day from the New Yorker archive of poetry one poem and just tweet it, because poems are cool. There are bots which will share photography, because photos are cool. So the fact of being a bot is not in itself a bad thing. What we work on is social bots and political bots. And these are accounts which pretend to be human beings, but either tweet individually in massive volumes, or tweet lots and lots of accounts, or tweet or post lots of the same thing all at the same time. And what they're doing is distorting democratic debate, and this is where the question of the threat to democracy comes in. If you think one of the key tenets of democracy is one man, one vote, or these days one person, one vote. If you have one person who has control of 10,000 fake accounts or 100,000 fake accounts online, and I have seen botnets which go over 100,000 in a single network, and that person gets all of those accounts to tweet this or post or share or like the same thing at the same time, what happens to one man, one vote? What happens to one man, one voice? You've got one person with 100,000 voices. And one of the main ways in which we see bots used is you'll get a small group of users who will try and create a trend on a platform simply by using loads and loads of bots interacting with each other to do it. And so, for example, during the French election, there was a group of activists on the far right in France who were supporting Marine Le Pen. And regularly at 4:50 p.m. every day of the week, they would launch a hashtag, and they would manage to get it trending. 4:50:00 every day. And the way they were doing this was using large networks of bots, together with a few trolls who were posting stuff. Looking at it, the main drivers of this traffic were 6 accounts. They were then amplified by a couple of hundred trolls. And between them, they were generating up to 45,000 tweets in the space of 90 minutes. And because of that volume, they were able to get their hashtags to trend. So you're thinking maybe 200 people in a country of 60 million people were managing to distort the debate to that extent. So that's the power of amplification. And it's like having a megaphone or a speaker system. One person mics themselves up with thousands of fake accounts, and they can blast their message out much more loudly. And again, thinking of the French case, there were articles, in example, in the Financial Times, talking about how powerful Le Pen supporters were on social media. Now, it was an accurate story, it was a good story, but it also highlighted the importance of a very, very small and radical group of people, and it ignored the other 59,999,740 people who just weren't involved in that. So it created the perception that Le Pen supporters were extremely powerful on social media, where in fact, again, it's a couple of hundred people. So it depends how you're measuring power. In terms of the work we do with the Digital Forensic Research Lab, one of the things we're doing is identifying bots and trolls and learning to tell them apart. And the way we normally do this is to look at 3 key indicators: activity, anonymity, and amplification. So the 3 A's: activity, anonymity, amplification. So you look at an account, and the first thing you do is you go to the profile page. And for example, on Twitter, it will always tell you when the account was created and how many times it's posted. So it's very easy to do the maths and say, well, if it was created 2 weeks ago, it's 14 days old, and it is posted 12,000 times. So, and this morning I found an account who had that pattern. So there's an account which is posting 1,000 times a day. This is not a human level of behavior. So either it's somebody who's an insomniac or it's a bot. There are accounts out there which I know which were created 15 months ago and have been posting 800 times a day ever since. Wow. There's no way that that's a human pattern of behavior. So that's when you look at the activity. And there are various different judgments of how active an account has to be. Then you look at the anonymity. Does it have a name, or does it just have a scramble of letters and numbers for its name? Does it have a photo? Does it have a background image? You'll quite often find loads and loads of faceless accounts. They don't even have an avatar picture. They don't have a username. They're anonymous. There's no way of telling if there's a human being behind them. So if it's active and anonymous, you start suspecting it's a bot. And then you look at what it's actually posting. If it's posting its own content, then maybe it's just somebody who really does live on caffeine and no sleep, possibly. But if it's all it's posting is shares of other people's accounts, and it's 100 or 200 or 300 or 400 retweets in a row, then you know that that is not a human being doing it. Because as we were saying, human beings want to share. If I'm online, I want to share my emotions and my thoughts. Why on earth would I be doing nothing but retweeting somebody else?
Right.
It doesn't make sense. So if you look at activity, anonymity, and amplification, you've got all three. You've got an account which is behaving like a bot.
So, real briefly, if I may follow up, I mean, I think the danger, you've outlined quite well the danger of how it works. But what happens when these messages by bots are then taken by people, and then it spreads even further? I mean, how is that? How do these bots influence human behavior?
There are a couple of ways they can do it. The most common one is if they're trying to push, for example, a hashtag or a phrase, and that begins to trend. So if they get enough traffic on it that the Twitter algorithm thinks, hey, this is a cool, trendy topic, then people who are not in that political bubble will see the hashtag crop up in their trending. And so the whole goal of these efforts is to make people who aren't in your little circle see what you're doing. So you manage to make it trend. Another way is sometimes that a particular genuine internet user will see it and pick up on it, and then they'll pass it on to all their followers. So it'll start with a botnet, but maybe that will trend in somebody's little local trending list. If that person's got 200,000 real followers and they retweet it, then it's out into the real world. So for the bot herders, most of the time it's about finding a way to make it trend or to get real people to notice it and start sharing it. The other main use of bots is to harass and intimidate people. So you'll find big clusters of botnets in the tens or hundreds of thousands, all of whom follow each other, and they will all start retweeting the same post at the same time. Now, because they all follow each other, and none of them is followed by any real human beings, nobody's going to see that. But if what they're posting is an abusive message which is addressed to a human user, then that human user's timeline is suddenly going to be flooded with 100,000 offensive messages. And more we're seeing bots being targeted in that way to intimidate individual users, and nobody else is going to see it because nobody else is involved in that information flow.
Wow. Thanks, Ben. Just maybe to remind everybody, a cool, trendy topic which is not being promoted by bots is the hashtag Riga Conf 17. And I invite others who are online to also join in as real people into this discussion. Now I want to turn now to Russia and Konstantin, because we've talked about already kind of the role of how there's a lot of manipulation on social media, and the suspicions, and evidence points that Russia's very good at using social media outside Russia to divide and to create divisions in different countries on different topics, which sometimes aren't even related remotely to Russian foreign policy. But inside Russia, on the other hand, it seems to be a different story. And I think what's very interesting when we looked at the protests earlier this year in March and June, and how much the opposition has become quite savvy in using young people and using social media, that the Kremlin is kind of behind the game in that regard. So I'd like to hear some of your comments, what you think, how it looks in Russia when in the context of the discussion that we've already talked about, when you do have real people who are using social media to oppose some of the Kremlin activities.
Well, I think the main thing is that, Adam, is to understand that Russia in many ways is still a, let's say, modern but not postmodern society. So there are lots of divisions inside the Russian society. And if you look at what the Kremlin is doing in terms of propaganda and media policy, it's actually geared up to the same thing or to the same goal that we repeatedly discussed during these 2 days. And that's essentially holding on to power, holding on to where the current people are with the kind of assets they have. So that is the main goal. This is the main goal of this kind of, if I may say so, media policy of the Kremlin. And here they find themselves increasingly in a situation in which there are two audiences for them. Just a few days ago, I attended an opening of an exhibition in Moscow, dedicated actually to 1917, to the 100 years of the revolution, Bolshevik takeover, and there were lots of, it was dedicated to essentially Lenin, documents of Lenin. And there was one of the people that is involved in organizing this exhibition, and he's been interviewed by Russia, Russia's main state channel. And so this very young correspondent, who's like 26 or 27, comes up to the mic to this esteemed archive researcher and says, you know, you have to speak very, very simply and very, very slowly. Our audience is above 50. And to me, it was quite a symbol of what's going on in the media picture and in media policy making in Russia. Essentially, you have, everyone was talking about the power of Russian television, say 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Right.
And what it turns out is that you have one section of the society which still actually watches television and which still gets its not only news but opinions from state-controlled TV networks. And the other section of the society which actually doesn't watch television. It's only online. For them, all these people that we discuss, the many times mentioned Mr. Kiselyov, who is the only Russian journalist, quote unquote, on the sanctions list. I mean, it's irrelevant to them. Well, he may be irrelevant as a GIF on their favorite online platform, but nothing more. For them, their video bloggers are more important. So, in a sense, you or their favorite Twitter accounts or Instagram accounts or whatever. Yeah. So, what you have these people following Alexei Navalny, for example, that do take their cue, they do take their emotions and their facts. And you would even say they take their political science and political education, not from the state media. And this created a situation in which, for example, the famous documentary about Mr. Medvedev's assets has now been watched by 25 million people. Okay, some of them may be automatically generated sort of likes or hits rather on the page, but still it's a vast thing which is comparable actually to ratings of top TV programs, top evening news on Russian state TV channels. And if it's been watched by, let's say, not even 20 million, 10 million people in Russia, then it's not only been watched by one person, it's been watched by the babushka and the dedushka and the rest of them. So I think that the outreach is pretty strong, and yes, I think Russian opposition, for lack of other tools, has become pretty savvy at using that. But on the other hand, of course, what you have, I mean, as Russian politician Vladimir Milov once said, yeah, I mean, preparation for politics happens online, but real politics happens offline in the real world. So in a sense, I think that you can say that the government is paying attention to what goes on. And the Kremlin's been very active in the last few years, especially after the protests of 2011, in buying up major internet portals and actually creating a new picture of the world for the Russians via, for example, forcing even notionally private companies like Yandex to censor their news aggregators. So things won't come up that the government doesn't like. Or alternatively, funding, well, botnets, as we all know, that push the message outside. And actually, I think that the messages that are being pushed, although they may be specific messages for Catalonia and then another set of specific messages for the American elections and then yesterday for the German elections, whatever, but if you look at the main tenor of what's being sold to the public, and especially in Russia, it's not policy specifics. It's not Putin is great. Well, he is great, of course. But if you look at the overall tone, what is being sold is actually cynicism and irresponsibility. And these two things go hand in hand because these are emotions, and these are also, what is important, easy emotions. Because once you're cynical and say, oh, well, you know, don't talk to me about Western democracy and, you know, this fight against corruption. Well, you had the, I don't know, the Minister, Health Secretary resigning in America because he used a private jet. So you see, in America, which is a great beacon of democracy, they tell us, and in Russia, I mean, it's the same thing. It's all corrupt. Of course, the difference is that in America you resign, you buy a private jet for public money. In Russia, you probably buy another jet. But that escapes the public. Yeah. And I think that Russia is extremely, what people really do not understand in the West, which I think is very important. 80% of Russian society doesn't travel. So when you tell people that corruption is actually the same in Russia and in the UK or in America or somewhere else, they believe it because they have absolutely no reference point to say, hold on a minute, this is not true because, you know, I studied in Ghent and I know it's not true. No, you have this amazing figures of, you know, 50 million Russians traveling across the world per year. No, it's not true. It's 50 million border crossings. I mean, I probably count for 10,000 Russians. So it's a bit like a passport botnet. What I want to say is that this message is simplified to a very significant part of the Russian population by the fact that they have absolutely no reference point. And because of that, not because they're stupid, but they don't have enough information to have an informed critique of what's being pushed on them. So it's cynicism and irresponsibility follows it. Because if all your troubles, the fact that you don't get paid a pension, or you get paid a very small one, they still pay pensions, or your local village medical point is being closed down, or you have a bad road, or you have a corrupt mayor, if it is all A, completely normal, and B, usually a fault of America, the Freemasons, Obama, you name it, I mean, green man from the UFO, then what can you do? And if you can't do anything, then what's the use of any kind of activism? What is the use of actually going and voting? And especially, what is the use of actually going voting for someone who is not promoted by the government? Because if you do and vote for someone who's being pushed by the government, then you probably are going to get your road fixed. Because these guys have the power. That is the logic. And I suppose that what you now have in the bigger cities, which are much more sort of, you know, media savvy, where people travel more. And we're talking years. We're talking about societal trends. What you see a gradual emergence of people who think independently. I don't want to use this word opposition, pro-Navalny, people who are able of independently critiquing reality and taking it in without any prompts from someone. I think this is the trend that we see. This is the trend that's been amplified by Mr. Navalny and the fact that he managed to address the young generation. And this is a trend that will continue. It doesn't mean that it's revolution tomorrow.
Right.
But it's definitely a societal change in the big cities which will have an impact on how the society eventually looks at this. If you wish, you can talk about opinion leaders. One last thing I want to mention in this respect, and that kind of circles back to the use of social media and video blogging and stuff like that. When I've spoken to, after the emergence of the famous Medvedev movie, I've spoken to someone who's been my journalism student, and she's 22 or 23 years old, and she's quite professional, and it's also the world she lives in. And she said to me, you know what? Why this was such a... He made a lot of anti-corruption sort of investigations, and it's not the first time he went on the web exposing stuff. Why this was so successful? Why? He said, because what's been used at the beginning of the film, as a journalist, you know that you have to start with something that hooks people, and they were going to watch for a minute or read for a paragraph. If they're left after that, you're not getting them back. If they are, if your claws are in them, then they continue reading or watching until the very end. So the clause that Navalny used was that from the very beginning he used a very small thing, Medvedev ordering trainers on Amazon. It wasn't about a chateau in Toscana, because it's completely irrelevant to an average Russian. He will never be in a Toscana chateau. And the young person probably will be, but he or she is still young enough, too young to be there, to travel enough. But the fact that this man is number 2 man in Russia, orders things from Amazon, was something they could relate to. And that actually made this video so successful? It was explanatory, and it was referenced in a way that was relevant to the target audience. So in a sense, you can see this is pure media theory which doesn't have anything to do with whether it's Facebook or whether it's a regular television.
Yeah.
But the way you merge it, you merge old media wisdom with new technologies and new insights into psychology is very important.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting.
And it's worth pointing out that at the demonstrations themselves, an awful lot of the demonstrators were holding up pairs of trainers.
I don't know.
Trainers actually became a physical symbol of what the demos were about.
Right. Christoph, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add something very, because in fact Konstantin said something very interesting about Russia. Russia being a closed market, right? This is very important, and this is a very major trend on social media. Everybody believes that internet is a universal tool, that people, you can meet any kind of people all over the planet, one of those 2 billion people on Facebook, that it's promoting diversity and so on and so on. A lot of studies are telling you the opposite, exactly the opposite. After 10 years of using those social media, you get rid of people that do not believe and think and live the other way compared to you. If you've got someone in my network who's voting Marine Le Pen, whatever, I'm going to get rid of it because I don't want to see these posts, so hate or whatever, etc. So at the end of the day, after some years, you end by only connecting with people who live like you, speak like you, share the same kind of value, whatever values, And in fact, social media are not establishing diversity. Human beings are doing just the opposite of diversity. They are forming together, they are joining together in clubs, in bubbles, right? And you very clearly see when you study social media that those bubbles are not connected to the other bubbles, right? And when we are talking about influence, when we talk about bots and the example of the bots, the network from Marine Le Pen, etc., is that kind of example. You have to activate your bubble, and you have to activate your bubble to make it loud, right? So people will understand, well, eventually something is going on there. So it's all about, creating this. But in fact, and one of the reasons why it's spectacular in Russia, we're all talking about Facebook, but just think about 2 countries, Russia and China. In those 2 countries, Facebook is nothing, nearly nothing. If you go to Russia, you will see that the number 1 network is Contact. Right? It's nothing to do with Facebook. So it's not connected to the rest of the world. It's not connected to the Western world. And if you go to China, you will see that Facebook is nowhere. Google is nowhere, right? Twitter is nowhere. People will talk about Baidu. People will talk about these networks that are pure Chinese, right? So the dream of a universal web or universal social media is controlled by those phenomena who are just putting people again in the same bubbles that are very closed.
Very good point. We have about 15 minutes or so, and I want to give some time to our audience who is here participating. A couple questions. I'll take 2 or 3. Yes, please.
My name is Natalia Frolova. I'm New Times Magazine from Russia. You just told that some people are closed in these bubbles, and my question about the censorship in the social media, how it can be organized, who should be responsible for it? We understand if we are call somebody for violation, if we insult somebody, but if we are talking about political interference in election, in some process, how should it be?
That's a question that has tried. This is a very important question that you're making. This point has tried to be addressed since internet is there, and nobody has ever managed to get this solved. If you're just talking about Facebook, Twitter, Contact, the big ones, okay, they will tell you, I'm not responsible. I'm just providing the tools, the means, right? And people are doing whatever they want to do on Facebook. Plus, we are an American company, so an American company has a First Amendment that was quoted before in the previous session, where freedom of speech is something like stone, right? If you go to France, if you go to Germany, if you go to other countries in Europe, etc., the freedom of speech regulation is not the same. You know, in France, if you say something against gay people or etc., you will be fined. You know, because it's prohibited. If you promote some racist post in France, as an example, you will be it will be fined as well. But it will not. It will stay on Twitter. It will stay on Facebook, because those companies are saying, okay, we're American companies and we respect the American rights. So it's nearly impossible. So who's responsible? We are responsible. And there's a big part of the you know, a previous speaker was telling, it's a pity that people do not teach history at schools anymore. I'm a strong believer that something that should be taught in the schools is how to use internet, how to use social networks, how to use that kind of stuff. This is a masterpiece, and for the people like 12 years old or whatever that are just happening to enter in those stuff, because if not, we will all be a planet of stupid people.
Thank you, Christophe.
Tomorrow on Russian television, famous French expert says there is no free speech in Europe.
I think we're waiting for the headline.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's how it's done.
Right.
That's how it's done for the
Exactly.
Russian audience, and they can absolutely discern. They wouldn't be able to figure out which context was used, when it was said, how it was said, what was the entourage, and what was the context.
And then you have 100,000 bots.
Saying, oh yeah, well,
free
they just
speech
said,
stuff,
this
yeah.
is a famous guy.
Yeah. But Christophe, you make a good point about education. However, I fear, having two little kids myself, is that our children are better users of social media than their teachers. And so this is a huge challenge.
Yes and no, because in fact they are confronted with instant flow of information, right? Like we are. If you don't stop, if you don't take some pushback from this flow, you cannot, your brain cannot understand, cannot get knowledge, right? It's a matter of getting knowledge. You have to stop. You have to stop the time, and you have to say, okay, I want to understand. You see things, but you don't understand things, right? So people are, at the end of the day, can talk about any kind of topic that is happening around the world, but they don't know anything about the topics themselves, like deeply, right? It's not knowledge, it's just kind of a memory.
Right.
And there are skills that you can teach kids which are really, really simple, like how to reverse search an image. So if you find an image in Google Chrome and you right-click on it, one of the options is search for this image in Google, and it'll show you all the other times that image has been used. If you find a fake internet account, show it to the kids and show them, look, here's a nice-looking account, quite often a young lady. Look, isn't it odd that she's got 17 different names and 17 different Twitter accounts and it's all the same photo? What do we think is going on there, children? It's skills like that which they're not going to pick up from their peers at school.
True.
But it's as simple as a right-click.
Yeah. Good point. I now know what I should do going back home. We have a question here, and then one more over here.
So, hello, Carlos Miksons from Latvian Public Television. Earlier you were talking about these bots who is sharing this content to make it popular. How do you fight this? Let's call this propaganda with counter-propaganda, or what?
No, I mean, if you put out more bots who are tweeting on the same subject, then you're just making the same subject louder. And there was a classic example in the US about a month ago where the New York Times published a very negative piece about Donald Trump. It was amplified by a number of bots which just amplify news posts, so they were unpolitical. Then they were amplified by anti-Trump bots. Then the pro-Trump brigade noticed this and started messaging each other saying, hey, and the phrase was Trump is his own worst enemy. So they started messaging each other on Trump is his own worst enemy. Then their bots kicked in and started amplifying them. And then further far-right bots kicked in and started amplifying that. So you had an enormous argument going on, but the result was that instead of trending for 1 hour, this thing trended for 8 hours because the two sides were going. So you don't want to use the same tactics. It'll make it worse. The best thing to do is actually teach people, how do you recognize a bot? By the time we've recognized them and posted about them, it's an hour and it's too late. But if you teach people, you look for the activity, you look for the anonymity, and you look for the amplification. Look at the account. Is there any way that you can tell it's a human being? If it is a human being, why is it posting 1,000 times a day? When does it sleep? Why is it only posting retweets? Well, there you've got a bot, and then it's up to you. Do you mute it? Do you report it as spam? Do you block it? The choice is yours. But if you can teach every user how to do that, then the bots will still be there, but there's much less impact that they can actually have.
Yeah, very good point. Okay, we'll take one question here yet.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Name is Hamid Lajavardi. I have a question to you. Could you explain the phenomenon of Navalny? Typically, over the last decade or so, if there was a serious opposition to Putin or Putinism, they were typically gotten rid of. And we have a few examples of that, whether they were journalists or politicians or whatever. But it seems like Navalny is walking the kind of walk where he's thrown into prison for a few days and then he's out and then they throw him into prison again. How do you analyze that? Is the Kremlin kind of saying, okay, you can be a little opposition, but don't get too cocky. If you do, we'll send you there. And if I may, to you, you talked about the fact that diversity in Facebook and the community that is created, but isn't it also the same in Russia with Contact or Baidu, that within Russia, it is also a community, it is also diversity. So it does serve some purpose within Russia for people to see different points of view that may not be necessarily the one from the Kremlin. Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we start?
Hamid, thank you for the question. I think you forgot that Alexei Navalny has a brother, Oleg. And Oleg is in jail. And he's a hostage of the Kremlin. And so while Alexei couldn't be put in jail for reasons I will also explain, his brother is there. And any kind of quote-unquote accident could happen to him anytime. So when we talk about Alexei Anatolievich, we have to remember that he's not alone in this big trouble. Secondly, I think that there is, of course, and you are quite right to say, that, of course, well, Russia is not North Korea. And the regime there is quite savvy at manipulating public opinion. Actually, that's what they spend most of their time on. And I suppose that the idea and the perception, the conclusion they drew from the 10-year Khodorkovsky saga is that you really don't want to create martyrs. And because if you put Navalny in jail, then the sequence is pretty clear. It's the Sakharov Prize, the European Parliament Prize, nomination for the Nobel Prize, and then have a problem. And it's a bigger one than with Mr. Khodorkovsky, because with Mr. Khodorkovsky, you had different public opinion in Russia from the one we have today. And you could go and say to, all the gullible sort of Western useful stooges, well, you see, he was an oligarch who robbed the Russian people, so, well, he's got his due. Well, a bit dirty, but still. No, you can't do that to Navalny. He's not an oligarch. He didn't rob the Russian people. So you can't have this narrative. So they've been there before. They don't want it now. What they think, that is my understanding. I'm not I don't work for the Kremlin, luckily. They think that they can have it under control. And they think that even with all these young people hitting the streets, well, eventually it's only, they are 17, 18, 20, well, then they have to go and raise a family and go into professions, and then they will become much more sober, and in the end they will value stability. And I think that this is, and some of them will partake in the corruption pie, eventually. So I think that the idea is that we have it under control. We have this. No one can say that we don't have an opposition. Well, Secretary Tillerson comes to Moscow tomorrow and says, well, you don't have democracy. And oh, come on. Navalny was on Echo Moskvy saying that Putin is a dictator yesterday. What more do you want? So this idea of controlled opposition that's boxed in, opposition in the ghetto, not new, really. But we have to remember there is a hostage, and we have to remember that this very frequently backfires. But who said that Russia is run by geniuses?
Christoph, briefly.
No, briefly, what you're saying is right. But in fact, when I was talking about bubbles, it's even smaller bubbles. even in a country like this, it's not a bubble of thousands or millions of people. You end up on Facebook, on Contact or wherever, with a bubble of 50 or 100 people that you share the same story every day. So you only see those 50 people, right? Facebook can have 2 billion people online. You will only see at least maximum 50 people. Because on the top of it, Facebook has invented an algorithm that will allow you to see only those people. Because Facebook believes, the machine, not Facebook, but the machine believes that those people are the ones you would prefer to see when you open your Facebook. So it limits, it narrows your horizon, and at the end of the day, you don't get diversity at all.
It's the same in Contact as Facebook, as Baidu, all of them are.
Yeah, that's the same. Yeah.
And if you think for example, on Twitter, when you're looking at an account, one of the the measures you're looking at is how many accounts they're following, and you think, I've seen accounts which are following 100,000 other accounts, and you think, no, that's just not possible. There is literally and physically no way you can do that. Anything more than a few hundred accounts, you can't actually keep up with them all. So this is where the machine meets the man. My laptop is a genius. I am not. So I can't actually track 1,000 accounts. And so there's this inherent human limitation on how much data you can process.
And Christoph, you brought up a really good point about the algorithms.
Yeah.
And I would add into that also is the fact that these social media sites now are private, profit-driven sites, which also use all that data that they gather to promote products.
Absolutely, and I've got, but you have to know that there's a group of people that are, Twitter is doing very badly at the stock market. It's not making any profit, and there are some voices all around Europe and including in America that are calling Twitter to become a foundation, right? Like Wikipedia or whatever, because in fact they believe that Twitter is so useful not only to Mr. Trump but to the community, to the journalists, to be informed and to be kept informed about what something is going on, that it shouldn't be like driven by profit or like that kind of stuff, but it should be driven by just like Wikipedia by users. And I think this is a fair idea, and it's a very good idea, and I'm sure this idea will grow, and I'm sure this idea will probably before next year will create something bigger.
Very interesting. Ben, I'm going to give you, we have 1 minute left. I'm going to give you the last word. End on something positive, because we've talked about a lot of the negative side of social media.
People are cleverer than bots. You can teach people how to spot bots. You can teach an 8-year-old how to spot bots. Everyone can learn it. The challenge is just making sure that people do.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you for the panelists for your very interesting insight. And thank you to the audience online who has been following us and watching the debate. And the conference will continue in a minute or two with the next panel in the big hall. Thank you.